War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Aylmer and Louise Maude. Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger Moline. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Book 6, Chapter 1. Prince Andrew had spent 2 years continuously in the country. All the plans Pierre had attempted on his estates, and constantly changing from one thing to another had never accomplished, were carried out by Prince Andrew without display and without perceptible difficulty. He had in the highest degree a practical tenacity which Pierre lacked, and without fuss or strain on his part, this set things going. On one of his estates the 300 serfs were liberated and became free agricultural laborers, this being one of the first examples of the kind in Russia. On other estates the serfs' compulsory labor was commuted for a quitrent. A trained midwife was engaged for Bogucharovo at his expense, and a priest was paid to teach reading and writing to the children of the peasants and household serfs. Prince Andrew spent half his time at Bald Hills with his father and his son, who was still in the care of nurses. The other half he spent in Bogucharovo cloister, as his father called Prince Andrew's estate. Despite the indifference to the affairs of the world he had expressed to Pierre, he diligently followed all that went on, received many books, and to his surprise noticed that when he or his father had visitors from Petersburg, the very vortex of life, these people lagged behind himself, who never left the country, in knowledge of what was happening in home and foreign affairs. Besides being occupied with his estates and reading a great variety of books, Prince Andrew was at this time busy with a critical survey of our last 2 unfortunate campaigns, and with drawing up a proposal for a reform of the army rules and regulations. In the spring of 1809 he went to visit the Ryazan estates, which had been inherited by his son, whose guardian he was. Warmed by the spring sunshine he sat in the calèche looking at the new grass, the first leaves on the birches, and the first puffs of white spring clouds floating across the clear blue sky. He was not thinking of anything, but looked absent-mindedly and cheerfully from side to side. They crossed the ferry where he had talked with Pierre the year before. They went through the muddy village, past threshing floors and green fields of winter rye, downhill where snow still lodged near the bridge, uphill where the clay had been liquefied by the rain, past strips of stubble land and bushes touched with green here and there, and into a birch forest, growing on both sides of the road. In the forest it was almost hot. No wind could be felt. The birches with their sticky green leaves were motionless, and lilac-colored flowers and the first blades of green grass were pushing up and lifting last year's leaves. The coarse evergreen color of the small fir trees scattered here and there among the birches was an unpleasant reminder of winter. On entering the forest the horses began to snort and sweated visibly. Peter, the footman, made some remark to the coachman. The latter assented. But apparently the coachman's sympathy was not enough for Peter, and he turned on the box toward his master. "How pleasant it is, your excellency," he said with a respectful smile. "What?" "It's pleasant, your excellency." "What is he talking about?" thought Prince Andrew. "Oh, the spring, I suppose," he thought as he turned around. "Yes, really, everything is green already. How early! The birches and cherry and alders too are coming out, but the oaks show no sign yet. Ah, here is one oak." At the edge of the road stood an oak. Probably 10 times the age of the birches that formed the forest, it was 10 times as thick and twice as tall as they. It was an enormous tree, its girth twice as great as a man could embrace, and evidently long ago some of its branches had been broken off and its bark scarred. With its huge, ungainly limbs sprawling unsymmetrically, and its gnarled hands and fingers, it stood an aged, stern, and scornful monster among the smiling birch trees. Only the dead-looking evergreen firs dotted about in the forest, and this oak refused to yield to the charm of spring or notice either the spring or the sunshine. "Spring, love, happiness," this oak seemed to say. "Are you not weary of that stupid, meaningless, constantly repeated fraud? Always the same and always a fraud? There is no spring, no sun, no happiness. Look at those cramped dead firs, ever the same, and at me too, sticking out my broken and barked fingers just where they have grown, whether from my back or my sides. As they have grown, so I stand, and I do not believe in your hopes and your lies." As he passed through the forest, Prince Andrew turned several times to look at that oak, as if expecting something from it. Under the oak, too, were flowers and grass, but it stood among them scowling, rigid, misshapen, and grim as ever. "Yes, the oak is right, 1,000 times right," thought Prince Andrew. "Let others, the young, yield afresh to that fraud, but we know life. Our life is finished." A whole sequence of new thoughts, hopeless but mournfully pleasant, rose in his soul in connection with that tree. During this journey he, as it were, considered his life afresh, and arrived at his old conclusion, restful in its hopelessness, that it was not for him to begin anything anew, but that he must live out his life, content to do no harm, and not disturbing himself or desiring anything. End of chapter 1. Recording by Roger Moline. And Peace. Book 6, Chapter 2. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. Prince Andrew had to see the marshal of the nobility for the district in connection with the affairs of the Ryazan estate of which he was trustee. This marshal was Count Ilyá Rostov, and in the middle of May Prince Andrew went to visit him. It was now hot spring weather. The whole forest was already clothed in green. It was dusty and so hot that on passing near water one longed to bathe. Prince Andrew, depressed and preoccupied with the business about which he had to speak to the marshal, was driving up the avenue in the grounds of the Rostovs' house at Otrádno. He heard merry girlish cries behind some trees on the right, and saw a group of girls running to cross the path of his calèche. Ahead of the rest and nearer to him ran a dark-haired, remarkably slim, pretty girl in a yellow chintz dress, with a white handkerchief on her head from under which loose locks of hair escaped. The girl was shouting something, but seeing that he was a stranger, ran back laughing without looking at him. Suddenly, he did not know why, he felt a pang. The day was so beautiful, the sun so bright, everything around so gay, but that slim, pretty girl did not know, or wish to know, of his existence, and was contented and cheerful in her own separate, probably foolish, but bright and happy life. What is she so glad about? What is she thinking of? Not of the military regulations, or of the arrangement of the Ryazan serfs' quittance. Of what is she thinking? Why is she so happy? Prince Andrew asked himself with instinctive curiosity. In 1809 Count Ilyá Rostov was living at Otrádno just as he had done in former years, that is, entertaining almost the whole province with hunts, theatricals, dinners, and music. He was glad to see Prince Andrew, as he was to see any new visitor, and insisted on his staying the night. During the dull day, in the course of which he was entertained by his elderly hosts and by the more important of the visitors, The old count's house was crowded on account of an approaching name day. Prince Andrew repeatedly glanced at Natásha, gay and laughing among the younger members of the company, and asked himself each time, "What is she thinking about? Why is she so glad?" That night, alone in new surroundings, he was long unable to sleep. He read a while and then put out his candle, but relit it. It was hot in the room, the inside shutters of which were closed. He was cross with the stupid old man, as he called Rostóv, who had made him stay by assuring him that some necessary documents had not yet arrived from town, and he was vexed with himself for having stayed. He got up and went to the window to open it. As soon as he opened the shutters, the moonlight, as if it had long been watching for this, burst into the room. He opened the casement. The night was fresh, bright, and very still. Just before the window was a row of pollard trees, looking black on one side and with a silvery light on the other. Beneath the trees grew some kind of lush, wet, bushy vegetation with silver-lit leaves and stems here and there. Farther back beyond the dark trees a roof glittered with dew. To the right was a leafy tree with brilliantly white trunk and branches, and above it shone the moon, nearly at its full, in a pale, almost starless spring sky. Prince Andrew leaned his elbows on the window ledge and his eyes rested on that sky. His room was on the first floor. Those in the rooms above were also awake. He heard female voices overhead. "Just once more," said a girlish voice above him, which Prince Andrew recognized at once. "But when are you coming to bed?" replied another voice. "I won't. I can't sleep. What's the use? Come now for the last time." Two girlish voices sang a musical passage, the end of some song. "Oh, how lovely! Now go to sleep and there's an end of it." "You go to sleep, but I can't," said the first voice, coming nearer to the window. She was evidently leaning right out, for the rustle of her dress and even her breathing could be heard. Everything was stone still, like the moon and its light and the shadows. Prince Andrew, too, dared not stir for fear of betraying his unintentional presence. "Sónya! Sónya!" he again heard the first speaker. "Oh, how can you sleep? Only look how glorious it is! Ah, how glorious! Do wake up, Sónya," she said almost with tears in her voice. "There never, never was such a lovely night before." Sónya made some reluctant reply. "Do just come and see what a moon! Oh, how lovely! Come here, darling, sweetheart, come here! There, you see? I feel like sitting down on my heels, putting my arms around my knees like this, straining tight as possible, and flying away like this. Take care, you'll fall out." He heard the sound of a scuffle and Sónya's disapproving voice. "It's past 1 o'clock." "Oh, you only spoil things for me. All right, go, go." Again all was silent, but Prince Andrew knew she was still sitting there. From time to time he heard a soft rustle and at times a sigh. Oh God, what does it mean?" she suddenly exclaimed. "To bed then, if it must be," and she slammed the casement. "For her I might as well not exist," thought Prince Andrew while he listened to her voice, for some reason expecting yet fearing that she might say something about him. "There she is again, as if it were on purpose," thought he. In his soul there suddenly arose such an unexpected turmoil of youthful thoughts and hopes, contrary to the whole tenor of his life, that unable to explain his condition to himself, he lay down and fell asleep at once. End of chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline. Peace. Book 6, Chapter 3. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. Next morning, having taken leave of no one but the Count, and not waiting for the ladies to appear, Prince Andrew set off for home. It was already the beginning of June when, on his return journey, he drove into the birch forest where the gnarled old oak had made so strange and memorable an impression on him. In the forest the harness bells sounded yet more muffled than they had done 6 weeks before, for now all was thick, shady, and dense, and the young firs dotted about in the forest did not jar on the general beauty, but, lending themselves to the mood around, were delicately green with fluffy young shoots. The whole day had been hot. Somewhere a storm was gathering, but only a small cloud had scattered some raindrops lightly, sprinkling the road and the sappy leaves. The left side of the forest was dark in the shade, the right side glittered in the sunlight, wet and shiny, and scarcely swayed by the breeze. Everything was in blossom. The nightingales trilled, and their voices reverberated, now near, now far away. Yes, here in this forest was the oak with which I agreed, thought Prince Andrew. But where is it? He again wondered, gazing at the left side of the road, and without recognizing it he looked with admiration at the very oak he sought. The old oak, quite transfigured, spreading out a canopy of sappy, dark green foliage, stood wrapped and slightly trembling in the rays of the evening sun. Neither gnarled fingers, nor old scars, nor old doubts and sorrows were any of them in evidence now. Through the hard, century-old bark, even where there were no twigs, leaves had sprouted such as one could hardly believe the old veteran could have produced. Yes, it is the same oak, thought Prince Andrew, and all at once he was seized by an unreasoning springtime feeling of joy and renewal. All the best moments of his life suddenly rose to his memory. Austerlitz with the lofty heavens, his wife's dead reproachful face, Pierre at the ferry, that girl thrilled by the beauty of the night, and that night itself and the moon, and all this rushed suddenly to his mind. No, life is not over at 31, Prince Andrew suddenly decided finally and decisively. It is not enough for me to know what I have in me. Everyone must know it. Pierre and that young girl who wanted to fly away into the sky. Everyone must know me, so that my life may not be lived for myself alone while others live so apart from it, but so that it may be reflected in them all, and they and I may live in harmony. On reaching home, Prince Andrew decided to go to Petersburg that autumn and found all sorts of reasons for this decision. A whole series of sensible and logical considerations showing it to be essential for him to go to Petersburg, and even to re-enter the service, kept springing up in his mind. He could not now understand how he could ever even have doubted the necessity of taking an active share in life, just as a month before he had not understood how the idea of leaving the quiet country could ever enter his head. It now seemed clear to him that all his experience of life must be senselessly wasted unless he applied it to some kind of work and again played an active part in life. He did not even remember how formerly, on the strength of similar wretched logical arguments, it had seemed obvious that he would be degrading himself if he now, after the lessons he had had in life, allowed himself to believe in the possibility of being useful and in the possibility of happiness or love. Now reason suggested quite the opposite. After that journey to Ryazan, he found the country dull. His former pursuits no longer interested him, and often, when sitting alone in his study, he got up, went to the mirror, and gazed a long time at his own face. Then he would turn away to the portrait of his dead Lise, who, with hair curled à la grecque looked tenderly and gaily at him out of the gilt frame. She did not now say those former terrible words to him, but looked simply, merrily, and inquisitively at him. And Prince Andrew, crossing his arms behind him, long paced the room, now frowning, now smiling, as he reflected on those irrational, inexpressible thoughts, secret as a crime, which altered his whole life and were connected with Pierre, with fame, with the girl at the window, the oak, and woman's beauty and love. And if anyone came into his room at such moments, he was particularly cold, stern, and above all, unpleasantly logical. "My dear," Princess Mary, entering at such a moment, would say, "little Nicholas can't go out today. It's very cold." "If it were hot," Prince Andrew would reply at such times very dryly to his sister, "he could go out in his smock. But as it is cold, he must wear warm clothes, which were designed for that purpose. That is what follows from the fact that it is cold, and not that a child who needs fresh air should remain at home," he would add with extreme logic, as if punishing someone for those secret illogical emotions that stirred within him. At such moments, Princess Mary would think how intellectual work dries men up. End of chapter 3. Recording by Roger Moline.
Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Book 6, Chapter 4. Read for LibriVox.org. Prince Andrew arrived in Petersburg in August 1809. It was the time when the youthful Speranski was at the zenith of his fame, and his reforms were being pushed forward with the greatest energy. On that same August, the Emperor was thrown from his calèche, injured his leg, and remained 3 weeks at Peterhof, receiving Speranski every day and no one else. At that time, the two famous decrees were being prepared that so agitated society, abolishing court ranks and introducing examinations to qualify for the grades of collegiate assessor and state councillor. And not merely these, but a whole state constitution intended to change the existing order of government in Russia, legal, administrative, and financial, from the Council of State down to the district tribunals. Now those vague liberal dreams with which the Emperor Alexander had ascended the throne, and which he had tried to put into effect with the aid of his associates, Czartoryski, Novosilitsev, Kochubey, and Stroganov, whom he himself in jest had called his Comité des Soins Publics, were taking shape and being realized. Now all these men were being replaced by Speranski on the civil side and Arakcheyev on the military. Soon after his arrival, Prince Andrew, as a gentleman of the chamber, presented himself at court and at a levee. The Emperor, though he met him twice, did not favor him with a single word. It had always seemed to Prince Andrew before that he was antipathetic to the Emperor, and that the latter disliked his face and personality generally. And in the cold, repellent glance the Emperor gave him, he now found further confirmation of this surmise. The courtiers explained the Emperor's neglect of him by His Majesty's displeasure at Bolkonsky's not having served since 1805. "I know myself that one cannot help one's sympathies and antipathies," thought Prince Andrew, "so it will not do to present my proposal for the reform of the army regulations to the Emperor personally, but the project will speak for itself." He mentioned what he had written to an old field marshal, a friend of his father's. The field marshal made an appointment to see him, received him graciously, and promised to inform the Emperor. A few days later, Prince Andrew received notice that he was to go to see the Minister of War, Count Arakcheyev. On the appointed day, Prince Andrew entered Count Arakcheyev's waiting room at 9 in the morning. He did not know Arakcheyev personally, had never seen him, and all he had heard of him inspired him with but little respect for the man. "He is Minister of War, a man trusted by the Emperor, and I need not concern myself about his personal qualities. He has been commissioned to consider my project, so he alone can get it adopted," thought Prince Andrew as he waited among a number of important and unimportant people in Count Arakcheyev's waiting room. During his service, chiefly as an adjutant, Prince Andrew had seen the anterooms of many important men, and the different types of such rooms were well known to him. Count Arakcheyev's anteroom had quite a special character. The faces of the unimportant people awaiting their turn for an audience showed embarrassment and servility. The faces of those of higher rank expressed a common feeling of awkwardness, covered by a mask of unconcern and ridicule of themselves, their situation, and the person for whom they were waiting. Some walked thoughtfully up and down, others whispered and laughed. Prince Andrew heard the nickname Sila Andreevich and the words "Uncle will give it to us hot" in reference to Count Arakcheyev. One general, an important personage, evidently feeling offended at having to wait so long, sat crossing and uncrossing his legs and smiling contemptuously to himself. But the moment the door opened, one feeling alone appeared on all faces, that of fear. Prince Andrew for the second time asked the adjutant on duty to take in his name, but received an ironical look, and was told that his turn would come in due course. After some others had been shown in and out of the minister's room by the adjutant on duty, an officer who struck Prince Andrew by his humiliated and frightened air was admitted at that terrible door. This officer's audience lasted a long time. Then suddenly the grating sound of a harsh voice was heard from the other side of the door, and the officer, with pale face and trembling lips, came out and passed through the waiting room, clutching his head. After this, Prince Andrew was conducted to the door, and the officer on duty said in a whisper, "To the right, at the window." Prince Andrew entered a plain, tidy room, and saw at the table a man of 40, with a long waist, a long, closely cropped head, deep wrinkles, scowling brows above dull, greenish hazel eyes, and an overhanging red nose. Arakcheyev turned his head toward him without looking at him. "What is your petition?" asked Arakcheyev. "I am not petitioning, your Excellency," returned Prince Andrew quietly. Arakcheyev's eyes turned toward him. "Sit down," said he. "Prince Bolkonsky?" "I am not petitioning about anything. His Majesty the Emperor has deigned to send your Excellency a project submitted by me—" "You see, my dear sir, I have read your project," interrupted Arakcheyev, uttering only the first words amiably, and then, again without looking at Prince Andrew, relapsing gradually into a tone of grumbling contempt. "You are proposing new military laws? There are many laws, but no one to carry out the old ones. Nowadays everybody designs laws. It is easier writing than doing." "I came at His Majesty the Emperor's wish to learn from your Excellency how you propose to deal with the memorandum I have presented," said Prince Andrew politely. "I have endorsed a resolution on your memorandum and sent it to the committee. I do not approve of it," said Arakcheyev, rising and taking a paper from his writing table. "Here." He handed it to Prince Andrew. Across the paper was scrawled in pencil, without capital letters, misspelled and without punctuation, "Unsoundly constructed, because it resembles an imitation of the French military code, and from the articles of war needlessly deviating." "To what committee has the memorandum been referred?" inquired Prince Andrew. "To the Committee on Army Regulations, and I have recommended that your honor should be appointed a member, but without a salary." Prince Andrew smiled. "I don't want one." "A member without a salary," repeated Arakcheyev. "I have the honor. Eh? Call the next one. Who else is there?" he shouted, bowing to Prince Andrew. End of chapter 4. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Book 6, Chapter 5, read for LibriVox.org. While waiting for the announcement of his appointment to the committee, Prince Andrew looked up his former acquaintances, particularly those he knew to be in power and whose aid he might need. In Petersburg he now experienced the same feeling he had had on the eve of a battle, when troubled by anxious curiosity and irresistibly attracted to the ruling circles where the future, on which the fate of millions depended, was being shaped. From the irritation of the older men, the curiosity of the uninitiated, The reserve of the initiated, the hurry and preoccupation of everyone, and the innumerable committees and commissions of whose existence he learned every day, he felt that now, in 1809, here in Petersburg, a vast civil conflict was in preparation, the commander-in-chief of which was a mysterious person he did not know, but who was supposed to be a man of genius, Speranski. And this movement of reconstruction, of which Prince Andrew had a vague idea, and Speranski its chief promoter, began to interest him so keenly that the question of the army regulations quickly receded to a secondary place in his consciousness. Prince Andrew was most favorably placed to secure good reception in the highest and most diverse Petersburg circles of the day. The reforming party cordially welcomed and courted him, in the first place because he was reputed to be clever and very well read, and secondly because by liberating his serfs he had obtained the reputation of being a liberal. The party of the old and dissatisfied, who censured the innovations, turned to him expecting his sympathy in their disapproval of the reforms, simply because he was the son of his father. The feminine society world welcomed him gladly, because he was rich, distinguished, a good match, and almost a newcomer, with a halo of romance on account of his supposed death and the tragic loss of his wife. Besides this, the general opinion of all who had known him previously was that he had greatly improved during these last 5 years, having softened and grown more manly, lost his former affectation, pride, and contemptuous irony, and acquired the serenity that comes with years. People talked about him, were interested in him, and wanted to meet him. The day after his interview with Count Arakcheyev, Prince Andrew spent the evening at Count Kochubey's. He told the Count of his interview with Sila Andreevich. Kochubey spoke of Arakcheyev by that nickname with the same vague irony Prince Andrew had noticed in the Minister of War's anteroom. "Mon cher, even in this case you can't do without Michael Mikhailovich Speranski. He manages everything. I'll speak to him. He has promised to come this evening." "What has Speranski to do with the army regulations?" asked Prince Andrew. Kochubey shook his head smilingly, as if surprised at Bolkonsky's simplicity. "We were talking to him about you a few days ago," Kochubey continued, "and about your freed plowmen." "Oh, is it you, Prince, who have freed your serfs?" said an old man of Catherine's day, turning contemptuously toward Bolkonsky. "It was a small estate that brought in no profit," replied Prince Andrew, trying to extenuate his action so as not to irritate the old man uselessly. "Afraid of being late," said the old man, looking at Kochubey. "There's one thing I don't understand," he continued. "Who will plow the land if they are set free? It is easy to write laws, but difficult to rule. Just the same as now, I ask you, Count, who will be heads of the departments when everybody has to pass examinations?" "Those who pass the examinations, I suppose," replied Kochubey, crossing his legs and glancing round. "Well, I have Pryanishnikov serving under me, a splendid man, a priceless man, but he's 60. Is he to go for examination?" "Yes, that's a difficulty, as education is not at all general, but—" Count Kochubey did not finish. He rose, took Prince Andrew by the arm, and went to meet a tall, bald, fair man of about 40, with a large open forehead and a long face of unusual and peculiar whiteness, who was just entering. The newcomer wore a blue swallow-tail coat with a cross suspended from his neck and a star on his left breast. It was Speranski. Prince Andrew recognized him at once, and felt a throb within him, as happens at critical moments of life. Whether it was from respect, envy, or anticipation, he did not know. Speranski's whole figure was of a peculiar type that made him easily recognizable. In the society in which Prince Andrew lived, he had never seen anyone who, together with awkward and clumsy gestures, possessed such calmness and self-assurance. He had never seen so resolute yet gentle an expression as that in those half-closed, rather human eyes, or so firm a smile that expressed nothing. Nor had he heard such a refined, smooth, soft voice. Above all, he had never seen such a delicate whiteness of face or hands which were broad, but very plump, soft and white. Such whiteness and softness Prince Andrew had only seen on the faces of soldiers, who had been long in hospitals. This was Speranski, Secretary of State, reporter to the Emperor, and his companion at Erfurt, where he had more than once met and talked with Napoleon. Speranski did not shift his eyes from one face to another as people involuntarily do on entering a large company, and was in no hurry to speak. He spoke slowly, with assurance that he would be listened to, and he looked only at the person with whom he was conversing. Prince Andrew followed Speranski's every word and movement with particular attention, as happens to some people, especially to men who judge those near to them severely. He always, on meeting anyone new, especially anyone whom, like Speranski, he knew by reputation, expected to discover in him the perfection of human qualities. Speranski told Kochubey he was sorry he had been unable to come sooner, as he had been detained at the palace. He did not say that the Emperor had kept him, and Prince Andrew noticed this affectation of modesty. When Kochubey introduced Prince Andrew, Speranski slowly turned his eyes to Bolkonsky with his customary smile, and looked at him in silence. "I am very glad to make your acquaintance. I had heard of you, as everyone has," he said after a pause. Kochubey said a few words about the reception Arakcheyev had given Bolkonsky. Speranski smiled more markedly. "The chairman of the Committee on Army Regulations is my good friend, Monsieur Magnitsky," he said, fully articulating every word and syllable. "And, if you like, I can put you in touch with him." He paused at the full stop. "I hope you will find him sympathetic and ready to cooperate in promoting all that is reasonable." A circle soon formed around Speranski, and the old man, who had talked about his subordinate Pryanichnikov, addressed a question to him. Prince Andrew, without joining in the conversation, watched every movement of Speranski's. This man, not long since an insignificant divinity student, who now, Bolkonsky thought, held in his hands, those plump white hands, the fate of Russia. Prince Andrew was struck by the extraordinarily disdainful composure with which Speranski answered the old man. He appeared to address condescending words to him from an immeasurable height. When the old man began to speak too loud, Speranski smiled and said he could not judge of the advantage or disadvantage of what pleased the sovereign. Having talked for a little while in the general circle, Speranski rose and coming up to Prince Andrew took him along to the other end of the room. It was clear that he thought it necessary to interest himself in Bolkonsky. "I had no chance to talk with you, Prince, during the animated conversation in which that venerable gentleman involved me," he said, with a mildly contemptuous smile, as if intimating by that smile that he and Prince Andrew understood the insignificance of the people with whom he had just been talking. This flattered Prince Andrew. "I have known of you for a long time, first from your action with regard to your serfs, a first example of which it is very desirable that there should be more imitators, and secondly, because you are one of those gentlemen of the chamber who have not considered themselves offended by the new decree concerning the ranks allotted to courtiers, which is causing so much gossip and tittle-tattle." "No," said Prince Andrew, "my father did not wish me to take advantage of the privilege. I began the service from the lower grade." "Your father, a man of the last century, evidently stands above our contemporaries who so condemn this measure, which merely re-establishes natural justice." "I think, however, that these condemnations have some ground," returned Prince Andrew, trying to resist Speranski's influence, of which he began to be conscious. He did not like to agree with him in everything, and felt a wish to contradict. Though he usually spoke easily and well, he felt a difficulty in expressing himself now while talking with Speranski. He was too much absorbed in observing the famous man's personality. "Grounds of personal ambition, maybe," Speranski put in quietly. "And of state interest to some extent," said Prince Andrew. "What do you mean?" asked Speranski quietly, lowering his eyes. "I am an admirer of Montesquieu," replied Prince Andrew, "and his idea that les principes des monarchies est les honneurs me paraît incontestable. Certains droits et privilèges de la noblesse me paraissent être des moyens de s'obtenir que sentiment. Translation. The principle of monarchies is honor seems to me incontestable. Certain rights and privileges for the aristocracy appear to me a means of maintaining that sentiment. End of translation. The smile vanished from Speranski's white face, which was much improved by the change. Probably Prince Andrew's thought interested him. Si vous envisagez la question sous quel point de vue? Translation. If you regard the question from that point of view. End of translation. He began, pronouncing French with evident difficulty and speaking even slower than in Russian, but quite calmly. Speranski went on to say that honor, Leonore, cannot be upheld by privileges harmful to the service, that honor, Leonore, is either a negative concept of not doing what is blameworthy, or it is a source of emulation in pursuit of condemnation and rewards, which recognize it. His arguments were concise, simple, and clear. An institution upholding honor, the source of emulation, is one similar to the Legion d'honneur of the great Emperor Napoleon, not harmful but helpful to the success of the service, but not a class of court privilege. I do not dispute that, but it cannot be denied that court privileges have attained the same end, returned Prince Andrew. Every courtier considers himself bound to maintain his position worthily. Yet you do not care to avail yourself of the privilege, Prince, said Speranski, indicating by a smile that he wished to finish amiably an argument which was embarrassing for his companion. If you will do me the honor of calling on me on Wednesday, he added, I will, after talking with Magnitsky, let you know what may interest you, and shall also have the pleasure of a more detailed chat with you. Closing his eyes, he bowed à la François, without taking leave, and trying to attract as little attention as possible. He left the room. End of chapter 5.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 6, read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnig. During the first weeks of his stay in Petersburg, Prince Andrew felt the whole trend of thought he had formed during his life of seclusion quite overshadowed by the trifling cares that engrossed him in that city. On returning home in the evening, he would jot down in his notebook 4 or 5 necessary calls or appointments for certain hours. The mechanism of life, the arrangement of the day so as to be in time everywhere, absorbed the greater part of his vital energy. He did nothing, did not even think or find time to think, but only talked and talked successfully of what he had thought while in the country. He sometimes noticed with dissatisfaction that he repeated the same remark on the same day in different circles. But he was so busy for whole days together that he had no time to notice that he was thinking of nothing. As he had done on their first meeting at Kochubey's, Speranski produced a strong impression on Prince Andrew on the Wednesday when he received him tête-à-tête at his own house and talked to him long and confidentially. To Bolkonsky, so many people appeared contemptible and insignificant creatures, and he so longed to find in someone the living idea of that perfection toward which he strove, that he readily believed that in Speranski he had found this ideal of a perfectly rational and virtuous man. Had Speranski sprung from the same class as himself and possessed the same breeding and traditions, Bolkonsky would soon have discovered his weak, human, unheroic sides. But, as it was, Speranski's strange and logical turn of mind inspired him with respect all the more because he did not quite understand him. Moreover, Speranski, either because he appreciated the other's capacity or because he considered it necessary to win him to his side, showed off his dispassionate, calm reasonableness before Prince Andrew, and flattered him with that subtle flattery which goes hand in hand with self-assurance and consists in a tacit assumption that one's companion is the only man beside oneself capable of understanding the folly of the rest of mankind and the reasonableness and profundity of one's own ideas. During their long conversation on Wednesday evening, Speranski more than once remarked, "We regard everything that is above the common level of rooted custom," or, with a smile, "But we want the wolves to be fed and the sheep to be safe," or, "They cannot understand this," and all in a way that seemed to say, "We, you and I, understand what they are and who we are." This first long conversation with Speranski only strengthened in Prince Andrew the feeling he had experienced toward him at their first meeting. He saw in him a remarkable, clear-thinking man of vast intellect, who by his energy and persistence had attained power which he was using solely for the welfare of Russia. In Prince Andrew's eyes, Speranski was the man he would himself have wished to be, one who explained all the facts of life reasonably, considered important only what was rational, and was capable of applying the standard of reason to everything. Everything seemed so simple and clear in Speranski's exposition that Prince Andrew involuntarily agreed with him about everything. If he replied and argued, it was only because he wished to maintain his independence and not submit to Speranski's opinions entirely. Everything was right and everything was as it should be. Only one thing disconcerted Prince Andrew. This was Speranski's cold, mirror-like look, which did not allow one to penetrate to his soul, and his delicate white hands, which Prince Andrew involuntarily watched as one does watch the hands of those who possess power. This mirror-like gaze and those delicate hands irritated Prince Andrew, he knew not why. He was unpleasantly struck, too, by the excessive contempt for others that he observed in Speranski, and by the diversity of lines of argument he used to support his opinions. He made use of every kind of mental device except analogy, and passed too boldly, it seemed to Prince Andrew, from one to another. Now he would take up the position of a practical man and condemn dreamers, now that of a satirist, and laugh ironically at his opponents, now grow severely logical, or suddenly rise to the realm of metaphysics. This last resource was one he very frequently employed. He would transfer a question to metaphysical heights, pass on to definitions of space, time, and thought, and, having deduced the refutation he needed, would again descend to the level of the original discussion. In general, the trait of Speranski's mentality which struck Prince Andrew most was his absolute and unshakable belief in the power and authority of reason. It was evident that the thought could never occur to him, which to Prince Andrew seemed so natural, namely, that it is after all impossible to express all one thinks, and that he had never felt the doubt, "Is not all I think and believe nonsense?" And it was just this peculiarity of Speranski's mind that particularly attracted Prince Andrew. During the first period of their acquaintance, Bolkonsky felt a passionate admiration for him, similar to that which he had once felt for Bonaparte. The fact that Speranski was the son of a village priest, and that stupid people might meanly despise him on account of his humble origin, as in fact many did, caused Prince Andrew to cherish his sentiment for him the more, and unconsciously to strengthen it. On that first evening Bolkonsky spent with him, having mentioned the commission for the revision of the Code of Laws, Speranski told him sarcastically that the commission had existed for 150 years, had cost millions, and had done nothing except that Rosenkampf had stuck labels on the corresponding paragraphs of the different codes. "And that is all the state has for the millions it has spent," said he. "We want to give the Senate new judicial powers, but we have no laws. That is why it is a sin for men like you, Prince, not to serve in these times." Prince Andrew said that for that work an education in jurisprudence was needed, which he did not possess. "But nobody possesses it, so what would you have? It is a vicious circle from which we must break a way out." A week later Prince Andrew was a member of the Committee on Army Regulations, and, what he had not at all expected, was chairman of a section of the Committee for the revision of the laws. At Speranski's request he took the first part of the Civil Code that was being drawn up, and with the aid of the Code Napoleon and the Institutes of Justinian he worked at formulating the section on personal rights. End of chapter 6. Recording by Eva Hanig, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Book 6, Chapter 7. Nearly 2 years before this, in 1808, Pierre, on returning to Petersburg after visiting his estates, had involuntarily found himself in a leading position among the Petersburg Freemasons. He arranged dining and funeral lodge meetings, enrolled new members, and busied himself uniting various lodges and acquiring authentic charters. He gave money for the erection of temples and supplemented as far as he could the collection of alms, in regard to which the majority of members were stingy and irregular. He supported almost single-handed a poorhouse the order had founded in Petersburg. His life meanwhile continued as before, with the same infatuations and dissipations. He liked to dine and drink well, and though he considered it immoral and humiliating, could not resist the temptations of the bachelor circles in which he moved. Amid the turmoil of his activities and distractions, however, Pierre at the end of a year began to feel that the more firmly he tried to rest upon it, the more Masonic ground on which he stood gave way under him. At the same time he felt that the deeper the ground sank under him, the closer bound he involuntarily became to the order. When he had joined the Freemasons, he had experienced the feeling of one who confidently steps onto the smooth surface of a bog. When he put his foot down, it sank in. To make quite sure of the firmness of the ground, he put his other foot down and sank deeper still, became stuck in it, and involuntarily waded knee-deep into the bog. Joseph Alexeyevich was not in Petersburg. He had of late stood aside from the affairs of the Petersburg lodges and lived almost entirely in Moscow. All the members of the lodges were men Pierre knew in ordinary life, and it was difficult for him to regard them merely as brothers in Freemasonry, and not as Prince B. or Ivan Vasilievich D., whom he knew in society mostly as weak and insignificant men. Under the Masonic aprons and insignia he saw the uniforms and decorations at which they aimed in ordinary life. Often, after collecting alms and reckoning up 20 or 30 rubles, received for the most part in promises from a dozen members, of whom half was able to pay as himself, Pierre remembered the Masonic vow in which each brother promised to devote all his belongings to his neighbor, and doubts on which he tried not to dwell arose in his soul. He divided the brothers he knew into 4 categories. In the first he put those who did not take an active part in the affairs of the lodges, or in human affairs, but were exclusively occupied with the mystical science of the order, with questions of the threefold designation of God, the 3 primordial elements, sulfur, mercury, and salt, or the meaning of the square and all the various figures of the Temple of Solomon. Pierre respected this class of brothers to which the elder ones chiefly belonged, including, Pierre thought, Joseph Alexeyevich himself, but he did not share their interests. His heart was not in the mystical aspect of Freemasonry. In the second category, Pierre reckoned himself and others like him, seeking and vacillating, who had not yet found in Freemasonry a straight and comprehensible path, but hoped to do so. In the third category he included those brothers, the majority, who saw nothing in Freemasonry but the external forms and ceremonies, and prized the strict performance of these forms without troubling about their purport or significance. Such were Willarski and even the Grand Master of the principal lodge. Finally, to the fourth category also a great many brothers belonged, particularly those who had lately joined. These, according to Pierre's observations, were men who had no belief in anything, nor desire for anything, but joined the Freemasons merely to associate with the wealthy young brothers who were influential through their connections or rank, and of whom there were very many in the lodge. Pierre began to feel dissatisfied with what he was doing. Freemasonry, at any rate as he saw it here, sometimes seemed to him based merely on externals. He did not think of doubting Freemasonry itself, but suspected that Russian Freemasonry had taken a wrong path and deviated from its original principles. And so, toward the end of the year, he went abroad to be initiated into the higher secrets of the order. In the summer of 1809, Pierre returned to Petersburg. Our Freemasons knew from correspondence with those abroad that Bezúkhov had obtained the confidence of many highly placed persons, had been initiated into many mysteries, had been raised to a higher grade, and was bringing back with him much that might conduce to the advantage of the Masonic cause in Russia. The Petersburg Freemasons all came to see him, tried to ingratiate themselves with him, and it seemed to them all that he was preparing something for them, and concealing it. A solemn meeting of the lodge of the second degree was convened, at which Pierre promised to communicate to the Petersburg brothers what he had to deliver to them from the highest leaders of their order. The meeting was a full one. After the usual ceremonies, Pierre rose and began his address. "Dear brothers," he began, blushing and stammering, with a written speech in his hand, "it is not sufficient to observe our mysteries in the seclusion of our lodge. We must act. Act! We are drowsing, but we must act." Pierre raised his notebook and began to read. "For the dissemination of pure truth and to secure the triumph of virtue," he read, "we must cleanse men from prejudice, diffuse principles in harmony with the spirit of the times, undertake the education of the young, unite ourselves in indissoluble bonds with the wisest men, boldly yet prudently overcome superstitions, infidelity and folly, and form of those devoted to us a body linked together by unity of purpose and possessed of authority and power. To attain this end we must secure a preponderance of virtue over vice, and must endeavor to secure that the honest man may, even in his world, receive a lasting reward for his virtue. But in these great endeavors we are gravely hampered by the political institutions of today. What is to be done in these circumstances? To favor revolutions, overthrow everything, repel force by force? No, we are very far from that. Every violent reform deserves censure, for it quite fails to remedy evil while men remain what they are, and also because wisdom needs no violence. The whole plan of our order should be based on the idea of preparing men of firmness and virtue, bound together by unity of conviction, aiming at the punishment of vice and folly, and patronizing talent and virtue, raising worthy men from the dust and attaching them to our brotherhood. Only then will our order have the power unobtrusively to bind the hands of the protectors of disorder, and to control them without their being aware of it. In a word, we must found a form of government holding universal sway, which should be diffused over the whole world without destroying the bonds of citizenship, and beside which all other governments can continue in their customary course and do everything except what impedes the great aim of our order, which is to attain for virtue the victory over vice. This aim was that of Christianity itself. It taught men to be wise and good, and for their own benefit to follow the example and instruction of the best and wisest men. At that time, when everything was plunged in darkness, preaching alone was of course sufficient. The novelty of truth endowed her with special strength. But now we need much more powerful methods. It is now necessary that man, governed by his senses, should find in virtue a charm palpable to those senses. It is impossible to eradicate the passions, but we must strive to direct them to a noble aim, and it is therefore necessary that everyone should be able to satisfy his passions within the limits of virtue. Our order should provide means to that end. As soon as we have a certain number of worthy men in every state, each of them again training two others, and all being closely united, everything will be possible for our order, which has already in secret accomplished much for the welfare of mankind. This speech not only made a strong impression, but created excitement in the lodge. The majority of the brothers, seeing in it dangerous designs of Illuminism, note, the Illuminati sought to substitute republican for monarchical institutions, met it with a coldness that surprised Pierre. The Grand Master began answering him, and Pierre began developing his views with more and more warmth. It was long since there had been so stormy a meeting. Parties were formed, some accusing Pierre of Illuminism, others supporting him. At that meeting he was struck for the first time by the endless variety of men's minds, which prevents the truth from ever presenting itself identically to two persons. Even those members who seemed to be on his side understood him in their own way, with limitations and alterations he could not agree to, as what he always wanted was to convey his thought to others, just as he himself understood it. At the end of the meeting, the Grand Master, with irony and ill will, reproved Bezúkhov for his vehemence, and said it was not love of virtue alone, but also a love of strife that had moved him in the dispute. Pierre did not answer him, and asked briefly whether his proposal would be accepted. He was told that it would not, and without waiting for the usual formalities, he left the lodge and went home. End of chapter 7.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 8. Read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Patinama. Chapter 8. Again Pierre was overtaken by the depression he so dreaded. For 3 days after the delivery of his speech at the lodge, he lay on a sofa at home, receiving no one and going nowhere. It was just then that he received a letter from his wife, who implored him to see her, telling him how grieved she was about him and how she wished to devote her whole life to him. At the end of the letter she informed him that in a few days she would return to Petersburg from abroad. Following this letter, one of the Masonic brothers, whom Pierre respected less than the others, forced his way in to see him, and, turning the conversation upon Pierre's matrimonial affairs, by way of fraternal advice, expressed the opinion that his severity to his wife was wrong, and that he was neglecting one of the first rules of Freemasonry by not forgiving the penitent. At the same time, his mother-in-law, Prince Vasíli's wife, sent to him, imploring him to come, if only for a few minutes, to discuss a most important matter. Pierre saw that there was a conspiracy against him, and that they wanted to reunite him with his wife, and in the mood he then was, this was not even unpleasant to him. Nothing mattered to him. Nothing in life seemed to him of much importance, and under the influence of the depression that possessed him, he valued neither his liberty nor his resolution to punish his wife.
No one is right and no one is to blame, so she too is not to blame, he thought.
If he did not at once give his consent to a reunion with his wife, it was only because in his state of depression he did not feel able to take any step. Had his wife come to him, he would not have turned her away. Compared to what preoccupied him, was it not a matter of indifference whether he lived with his wife or not? Without replying, either to his wife or his mother-in-law, Pierre, late one night, prepared for a journey and started for Moscow to see Joseph Alexeyevich. This is what he noted in his diary.
Moscow, 17th of November. I have just returned from my benefactor and hasten to write down what I have experienced. Joseph Alexeyevich is living poorly and has for 3 years been suffering from a painful disease of the bladder. No one has ever heard him utter a groan or a word of complaint. From morning till late at night, except when he eats his very plain food, he is working at science. He received me graciously and made me sit down on the bed on which he lay. I made the sign of the Knights of the East and of Jerusalem, and he responded in the same manner, asking me with a mild smile what I had learned and gained in the Prussian and Scottish lodges. I told him everything as best I could, and told him what I had proposed to our Petersburg lodge, of the bad reception I had encountered, and of my rupture with the brothers. Joseph Alexeyevich, having remained silent and thoughtful for a good while, told me his view of the matter, which at once lit up for me my whole past and the future path I should follow. He surprised me by asking whether I remembered the threefold aim of the order. First, the preservation and study of the mystery. Second, the purification and reformation of oneself for its reception. And third, the improvement of the human race by striving for such purification. Which is the principal aim of these three? Certainly self-reformation and self-purification. Only to this aim can we always strive independently of circumstances. But at the same time, just this aim demands the greatest efforts of us, and so, led astray by pride, losing sight of this aim, we occupy ourselves either with a mystery, which in our impurity we are unworthy to receive, or seek the reformation of the human race, while ourselves setting an example of baseness and profligacy. Illuminism is not a pure doctrine, just because it is attracted by social activity and puffed up by pride. On this ground, Joseph Alexeyevich condemned my speech and my whole activity, and in the depth of my soul I agreed with him. Talking of my family affairs, he said to me, "The chief duty of a true Mason, as I have told you, lies in perfecting himself. We often think that by removing all the difficulties of our life we shall more quickly reach our aim, but on the contrary, my dear sir, it is only in the midst of worldly cares that we can attain our three chief aims. First, self-knowledge, for man can only know himself by comparison. Second, self-perfecting, which can only be attained by conflict. And third, the attainment of the chief virtue, love of death. Only the vicissitudes of life can show us its vanity and develop our innate love of death or of rebirth to a new life." These words are all the more remarkable because, in spite of his great physical sufferings, Joseph Alexeyevich is never weary of life, though he loves death, for which, In spite of the purity and loftiness of his inner man, he does not yet feel himself sufficiently prepared. My benefactor then explained to me fully the meaning of the great square of creation, and pointed out to me that the numbers 3 and 7 are the basis of everything. He advised me not to avoid intercourse with the Petersburg brothers, but to take up only second-grade posts in the lodge, to try, while diverting the brothers from pride, to turn them toward the true path, self-knowledge and self-perfecting. Besides this, he advised me, for myself personally, above all, to keep a watch over myself, and to that end he gave me a notebook, the one I am now writing in, and in which I will, in future, note down all my actions. Petersburg, the 23rd of November. I am again living with my wife. My mother-in-law came to me in tears and said that Helene was here and that she implored me to hear her, that she was innocent and unhappy at my desertion, and much more. I knew that if I once let myself see her, I should not have strength to go on refusing what she wanted. In my perplexity, I did not know whose aid and advice to seek. Had my benefactor been here, he would have told me what to do. I went to my room and reread Joseph Alexeyevich's letters and recalled my conversations with him, and deduced from it all that I ought not to refuse a suppliant, and ought to reach a helping hand to everyone, especially to one so closely bound to me, and that I must bear my cross. But if I forgive her for the sake of doing right, then let union with her have only a spiritual aim. That is what I decided, and what I wrote to Joseph Alexeyevich. I told my wife that I begged her to forget the past, to forgive me whatever wrong I may have done her, and that I had nothing to forgive her. It gave me joy to tell her this. She need not know how hard it was for me to see her again. I have settled on the upper floor of this big house, and am experiencing a happy feeling of regeneration. End of chapter 8. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands. This recording is in the public domain.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 9. Read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. At that time, as always happens, the highest society that met at court and at the grand balls was divided into several circles, each with its own particular tone. The largest of these was the French circle of the Napoleonic alliance, the circle of Count Rumyantsev and Caulaincourt. In this group, Helene, as soon as she had settled in Petersburg with her husband, took a very prominent place. She was visited by the members of the French embassy and by many belonging to that circle and noted for their intellect and polished manners. Helene had been at Erfurt during the famous meeting of the emperors and had brought from there these connections with the Napoleonic notabilities. At Erfurt her success had been brilliant. Napoleon himself had noticed her in the theatre and said of her, "C'est un superbe animal." This is a superb animal. Her success as a beautiful and elegant woman did not surprise Pierre, for she had become even handsomer than before. What did surprise him was that during these last 2 years his wife had succeeded in gaining the reputation d'une femme charmante, aussi spirituelle que belle, of a charming woman, as witty as she is lovely. The distinguished Prince de Ligne wrote her 8-page letters. Bilíbin saved up his epigrams to produce them in Countess Bezúkhova's presence. To be received in the Countess Bezúkhova's salon was regarded as a diploma of intellect. Young men read books before attending Helene's evenings to have something to say in her salon, and secretaries of the embassy and even ambassadors confided diplomatic secrets to her, so that in a way Helene was a power. Pierre, who knew she was very stupid, sometimes attended, with a strange feeling of perplexity and fear, her evenings and dinner parties, where politics, poetry, and philosophy were discussed. At these parties his feelings were like those of a conjurer who always expects his trick to be found out at any moment. But whether because stupidity was just what was needed to run such a salon, or because those who were deceived found pleasure in the deception, at any rate it remained unexposed, and Helene Bezúkhova's reputation as a lovely and clever woman became so firmly established that she could say the emptiest and stupidest things, and everybody would go into raptures over every word of hers and look for a profound meaning in it, of which she herself had no conception. Pierre was just the husband needed for a brilliant society woman. He was that absent-minded crank, a grand seigneur husband who was in no one's way, and far from spoiling the high tone and general impression of the drawing-room, he served, by the contrast he presented to her, as an advantageous background to his elegant and tactful wife. Pierre, during the last 2 years, as a result of his continual absorption in abstract interest and his sincere contempt for all else, had acquired in his wife's circle, which did not interest him, that air of unconcern, indifference, and benevolence toward all, which cannot be acquired artificially, and therefore inspires involuntary respect. He entered his wife's drawing-room as one enters a theater, was acquainted with everybody, equally pleased to see everyone, and equally indifferent to them all. Sometimes he joined in a conversation which interested him, and regardless of whether any gentlemen of the embassy were present or not, whisperingly expressed his views, which were sometimes not at all in accord with the accepted tone of the moment. But the general opinion concerning the queer husband of the most distinguished woman in Petersburg was so well established that no one took his freaks seriously. Among the many young men who frequented her house every day, Boris Drubetskoy, who had already achieved great success in the service, was the most intimate friend of the Bezúkhov household since Helene's return from Erfurt. Helene spoke of him as mon page and treated him like a child. Her smile for him was the same as for everybody, but sometimes that smile made Pierre uncomfortable. Toward him, Boris behaved with a particularly dignified and sad deference. This shade of deference also disturbed Pierre. He had suffered so painfully 3 years before from the mortification to which his wife had subjected him, that he now protected himself from the danger of its repetition, first by not being a husband to his wife, and secondly by not allowing himself to suspect. No, now that she has become a blue-stocking, she has finally renounced her former infatuations, he told himself. There has never been an instance of a blue-stocking being carried away by affairs of the heart. A statement which, though gathered from an unknown source, he believed implicitly. Yet, strange to say, Borís' presence in his wife's drawing-room, and he was almost always there, had a physical effect upon Pierre. It constricted his limbs and destroyed the unconsciousness and freedom of his movements. What a strange antipathy, thought Pierre, yet I used to like him very much. In the eyes of the world, Pierre was a great gentleman, the rather blind and absurd husband of a distinguished wife, a clever crank who did nothing but harmed nobody, and was a first-rate good-natured fellow. But a complex and difficult process of internal development was taking place all this time in Pierre's soul, revealing much to him and causing him many spiritual doubts and joys. End of chapter 9. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 10. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Pierre went on with his diary, and this is what he wrote in it during that time. 24th November. Got up at 8, read the scriptures, then went to my duties. By Joseph Alexeyevitch's advice, Pierre had entered the service of the state and served on one of the committees. Returned home for dinner and dined alone. The Countess had many visitors I do not like. I ate and drank moderately, and after dinner copied out some passages for the brothers. In the evening I went down to the Countess and told a funny story about B, and only remembered that I ought not to have done so when everybody laughed loudly at it. I am going to bed with a happy and tranquil mind. Great God, help me to walk in thy paths. 1. To conquer anger by calmness and deliberation. 2. To vanquish lust by self-restraint and repulsion. 3. To withdraw from worldliness, but not avoid A. the service of the state, B. family duties, C. relations with my friends and the management of my affairs. 27th November. I got up late. On waking, I lay long in bed yielding to sloth. O God, help and strengthen me, that I may walk in thy ways. Read the scriptures, but without proper feeling. Brother Urusov came, and we talked about worldly vanities. He told me of the Emperor's new projects. I began to criticize them, but remembered my rules and my benefactor's words that a true Freemason should be a zealous worker for the state when his aid is required, and a quiet onlooker when not called on to assist. My tongue is my enemy. Brothers G, V, and O visited me, and we had a preliminary talk about the reception of a new brother. They laid on me the duty of rhetor. I feel myself weak and unworthy. Then our talk turned to the interpretation of the 7 pillars and steps of the temple, the 7 sciences, the 7 virtues, the 7 vices, and the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Brother O was very eloquent. In the evening the admission took place. The new decoration of the premises contributed much to the magnificence of the spectacle. It was Boris Drubetskoy who was admitted. I nominated him and was the rhetor. A strange feeling agitated me all the time I was alone with him in the dark chamber. I caught myself harboring a feeling of hatred toward him, which I vainly tried to overcome. That is why I should really like to save him from evil and lead him into the path of truth, but evil thoughts of him did not leave me. It seemed to me that his object in entering the brotherhood was merely to be intimate and in favor with members of our lodge. Apart from the fact that he asked me several times whether N or S were members of our lodge, a question to which I could not reply, and that, according to my observation, he is incapable of feeling respect for our holy order, and is too preoccupied and satisfied with the outer man to desire spiritual improvement, I had no cause to doubt him, but he seemed to me insincere, and all the time I stood alone with him in the dark temple, it seemed to me that he was smiling contemptuously at my words, and I wished really to stab his bare breast with the sword I held to it. I could not be eloquent, nor could I frankly mention my doubts to the brothers and to the Grand Master. Great architect of nature, help me to find the true path out of the labyrinth of lies. After this, 3 pages were left blank in the diary, and then the following was written. I have had a long and instructive talk alone with Brother V, who advised me to hold fast by Brother A. Though I am unworthy, much was revealed to me. Adonai is the name of the Creator of the world. Elohim is the name of the ruler of all. The third name is the name unutterable, which means the all. Talks with Brother V strengthen, refresh, and support me in the path of virtue. In his presence, doubt has no place. The distinction between the poor teachings of mundane science and our sacred, all-embracing teaching is clear to me. Human science dissects everything to comprehend it and kills everything to examine it. In the holy science of our order, all is one. All is known in its entirety and life. The Trinity, the 3 elements of matter, are sulfur, mercury, and salt. Sulfur is of an oily and fiery nature. In combination with salt, by its fiery nature, it arouses a desire in the latter, by means of which it attracts mercury, seizes it, holds it, and in combination produces other bodies. Mercury is a fluid, volatile, spiritual essence. Christ, the Holy Spirit, Him. 3rd December. Awoke late, read the scriptures, but was apathetic. Afterwards went and paced up and down the large hall. I wished to meditate, but instead my imagination pictured an occurrence of 4 years ago, when Dolokhov, meeting me in Moscow after our duel, said he hoped I was enjoying perfect peace of mind in spite of my wife's absence. At the time I gave him no answer. Now I recalled every detail of that meeting, and in my mind gave him the most malevolent and bitter replies. I recollected myself and drove away that thought only when I found myself glowing with anger, but I did not sufficiently repent. Afterwards, Boris Drubetskoy came and began relating various adventures. His coming vexed me from the first, and I said something disagreeable to him. He replied. I flared up and said much that was unpleasant and even rude to him. He became silent, and I recollected myself only when it was too late. My God, I cannot get on with him at all. The cause of this is my egotism. I set myself above him, and so become much worse than he, for he is lenient to my rudeness, while I, on the contrary, nourish contempt for him. O God, grant that in his presence I may rather see my own vileness and behave so that he too may benefit. After dinner I fell asleep, and as I was drowsing off, I clearly heard a voice saying in my left ear, "Thy day." I dreamed that I was walking in the dark and was suddenly surrounded by dogs, but I went on undismayed. Suddenly a smallish dog seized my left thigh with its teeth and would not let go. I began to throttle it with my hands. Scarcely had I torn it off before another, a bigger one, began biting me. I lifted it up, but the higher I lifted it, the bigger and heavier it grew. And suddenly Brother A came, and taking my arm, led me to a building to enter, which we had to pass along a narrow plank. I stepped on it, but it bent and gave way, and I began to clamber up a fence which I could scarcely reach with my hands. After much effort, I dragged myself up so that my leg hung down on one side and my body on the other. I looked round and saw Brother A standing on the fence and pointing me to a broad avenue and garden, and in the garden was a large and beautiful building. I woke up. O Lord, great architect of nature, help me to tear from myself these dogs, my passions especially, the last, which unites in itself the strength of all the former ones, and aid me to enter that temple of virtue, the vision of which I attained in my dream. 7th December. I dreamed that Joseph Alexeyevich was sitting in my house, and that I was very glad and wished to entertain him. It seemed as if I chatted incessantly with other people, and suddenly remembered that this could not please him, and I wished to come close to him and embrace him. But as soon as I drew near, I saw that his face had changed and grown young, and he was quietly telling me something about the teaching of our order, but so softly that I could not hear it. Then it seemed that we all left the room, and something strange happened. We were sitting or lying on the floor. He was telling me something, and I wished to show him my sensibility, and not listening to what he was saying, I began picturing to myself the condition of my inner man and the grace of God sanctifying me. And tears came into my eyes, and I was glad he noticed this. But he looked at me with vexation and jumped up, breaking off his remarks. I felt abashed and asked whether what he had been saying did not concern me. But he did not reply, gave me a kind look, and then we suddenly found ourselves in my bedroom, where there is a double bed. He lay down on the edge of it, and I burned with longing to caress him and lie down too. And he said, "Tell me frankly, what is your chief temptation? Do you know it? I think you know it already." Abashed by this question, I replied that sloth was my chief temptation. He shook his head incredulously, and even more abashed, I said that though I was living with my wife as he advised, I was not living with her as her husband. To this he replied that one should not deprive a wife of one's embraces, and gave me to understand that that was my duty. But I replied that I should be ashamed to do it, and suddenly everything vanished. And I awoke and found in my mind the text from the Gospel. The life was the light of man, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Joseph Alexeyevich's face had looked young and bright. That day I received a letter from my benefactor, in which he wrote about conjugal duties. 9th December. I had a dream from which I awoke with a throbbing heart. I saw that I was in Moscow in my house in the big sitting room, and Joseph Alexeyevich came in from the drawing room. I seemed to know at once that the process of regeneration had already taken place in him, and I rushed to meet him. I embraced him and kissed his hands, and he said, "Hast thou noticed that my face is different?" I looked at him, still holding him in my arms, and saw that his face was young, but he had no hair on his head, and his features were quite changed. And I said, "I should have known you had I met you by chance." And I thought to myself, "Am I telling the truth?" And suddenly I saw him lying like a dead body. Then he gradually recovered and went with me into my study, carrying a large book of sheets of drawing paper. I said, "I drew that," and he answered by bowing his head. I opened the book, and on all the pages there were excellent drawings. And in my dream I knew that these drawings represented the love adventures of the soul with its beloved. And on its pages I saw a beautiful representation of a maiden in transparent garments and with a transparent body, flying up to the clouds. And I seemed to know that this maiden was nothing else than a representation of the Song of Songs. And looking at those drawings, I dreamed I felt that I was doing wrong, but could not tear myself away from them. Lord, help me. My God, if thy forsaking me is thy doing, thy will be done. But if I am myself the cause, teach me what I should do. I shall perish of my debauchery if thou utterly desertest me. End of chapter 10. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 11. Read for LibriVox.org by Tamara Hamilton. The Rostovs' monetary affairs had not improved during the 2 years they had spent in the country. Though Nicholas Rostov had kept firmly to his resolution and was still serving modestly in an obscure regiment, spending comparatively little, the way of life at Otradno, Mitenka's management of affairs in particular, was such that the debts inevitably increased every year. The only resource obviously presenting itself to the old count was to apply for an official post, so he had come to Petersburg to look for one, and also, as he said, to let the lassies enjoy themselves for the last time. Soon after their arrival in Petersburg, Berg proposed to Vera and was accepted. Though in Moscow the Rostovs belonged to the best society without themselves giving it a thought, yet in Petersburg their circle of acquaintances was a mixed and indefinite one. In Petersburg they were provincials, and the very people they had entertained in Moscow without inquiring to what set they belonged, here looked down on them. The Rostovs lived in the same hospitable way in Petersburg as in Moscow, and the most diverse people met at their suppers: country neighbors from Otradno, impoverished old squires and their daughters, Peronskaya, a maid of honor, Pierre Bezhukov, and the son of their district postmaster who had obtained a post in Petersburg. Among the men who very soon became frequent visitors at the Rostovs' house in Petersburg were Boris, Pierre, whom the count had met in the street and dragged home with him, and Berg, who spent whole days at the Rostovs and paid the eldest daughter, Countess Vera, the attentions a young man pays when he intends to propose. Not in vain had Berg shown everybody his right hand wounded at Austerlitz and held a perfectly unnecessary sword in his left. He narrated that episode so persistently and with so important an air that everyone believed in the merit and usefulness of his deed, and he had obtained 2 decorations for Austerlitz. In the Finnish War he also managed to distinguish himself. He had picked up the scrap of a grenade that had killed an aide-de-camp standing near the commander-in-chief, and had taken it to his commander. Just as he had done after Austerlitz, he related this occurrence at such length and so insistently that every one again believed it had been necessary to do this, and he received 2 decorations for the Finnish War also. In 1809 he was a captain in the Guards, wore medals, and held some special lucrative posts in Petersburg. Though some skeptics smiled when told of Berg's merits, it could not be denied that he was a painstaking and brave officer, on excellent terms with his superiors, and a moral young man with a brilliant career before him and an assured position in society. 4 years before, meeting a German comrade in the stalls of a Moscow theater, Berg had pointed out Vera Rostova to him, and had said in German, "Das soll mein Weib werden, that girl shall be my wife," and from that moment had made up his mind to marry her. Now in Petersburg, having considered the Rostovs' position and his own, he decided that the time had come to propose. Berg's proposal was at first received with a perplexity that was not flattering to him. At first it seemed strange that the son of an obscure Livonian gentleman should propose marriage to a Countess Rostova, but Berg's chief characteristic was such a naive and good-natured egotism that the Rostovs involuntarily came to think it would be a good thing, since he himself was so firmly convinced that it was good, indeed excellent. Moreover, the Rostovs' affairs were seriously embarrassed, as the suitor could not but know, and above all, Vera was 24, had been taken out everywhere, and though she was certainly good-looking and sensible, no one up to now had proposed to her, so they gave their consent. "You see," said Berg to his comrade, whom he called friend only because he knew that everyone has friends, "you see, I have considered it all, and should not marry if I had not thought it all out, or if it were in any way unsuitable. But on the contrary, my papa and mamma are now provided for, I have arranged that rent for them in the Baltic provinces, and I can live in Petersburg on my pay, and with her fortune and my good management we can get along nicely. I am not marrying for money, I consider that dishonorable, but a wife should bring her share and a husband his. I have my position in the service, she has connections and some means. In our times that is worth something, isn't it? But above all she is a handsome, estimable girl, and she loves me." Berg blushed and smiled. "And I love her, because her character is sensible and very good. Now the other sister, though they are the same family, is quite different. An unpleasant character, and has not the same intelligence. She is so, you know, unpleasant. But my fiancé, well, you will be coming," he was going to say, "to dine," but changed his mind and said, "to take tea with us," and quickly doubling up his tongue he blew a small round ring of tobacco smoke perfectly embodying his dream of happiness. After the first feeling of perplexity aroused in the parents by Berg's proposal, the holiday tone of joyousness usual at such times took possession of the family, but the rejoicing was external and insincere. In the family's feeling towards this wedding a certain awkwardness and constraint was evident, as if they were ashamed of not having loved Vera sufficiently and of being so ready to get her off their hands. The old count felt this most. He would probably have been unable to state the cause of his embarrassment, but it resulted from the state of his affairs. He did not know at all how much he had, what his debts amounted to, or what dowry he could give Vera. When his daughters were born he had assigned to each of them for her dowry an estate with 300 serfs, but one of these estates had already been sold, and the other was mortgaged and the interest so much in arrears that it would have to be sold, so that it was impossible to give it to Vera. Nor had he any money. Berg had already been engaged a month, and only a week remained before the wedding, but the count had not yet decided in his own mind the question of the dowry, nor spoken to his wife about it. At one time the count thought of giving her the Ryazan estate, or of selling a forest, at another time of borrowing money on a note of hand. A few days before the wedding Berg entered the count's study early one morning and, with a pleasant smile, respectfully asked his future father-in-law to let him know what Véra's dowry would be. The count was so disconcerted by this long-foreseen inquiry that without consideration he gave the first reply that came into his head. "I like your being businesslike about it. I like it. You shall be satisfied." And patting Berg on the shoulder he got up, wishing to end the conversation. But Berg, smiling pleasantly, explained that if he did not know for certain how much Véra would have and did not receive at least part of the dowry in advance, he would have to break matters off. "Because, consider, Count, if I allowed myself to marry now without having definite means to maintain my wife, I should be acting badly." The conversation ended by the count, who wished to be generous and to avoid further importunity, saying that he would give a note of hand for 80,000 roubles. Berg smiled meekly, kissed the count on the shoulder, and said that he was very grateful, but that it was impossible for him to arrange his new life without receiving 30,000 in ready money. Or at least 20,000, Count, he added, and then a note of hand for only 60,000. Yes, yes, all right, said the count hurriedly. Only excuse me, my dear fellow, I'll give you 20,000 and a note of hand for 80,000 as well. Yes, yes, kiss me. End of chapter 11. Peace, Book 6, Chapter 12, read for LibriVox.org by Tamara Hamilton. Natasha was 16, and it was the year 1809, the very year to which she had counted on her fingers with Boris after they had kissed 4 years ago. Since then she had not seen him. Before Sónya and her mother, if Boris happened to be mentioned, she spoke quite freely of that episode as of some childish, long-forgotten matter that was not worth mentioning. But in the secret depths of her soul the question whether her engagement to Boris was a jest or an important binding promise tormented her. Since Boris left Moscow in 1805 to join the army, he had not seen the Rostovs. He had been in Moscow several times and had passed near Otradno, but had never been to see them. Sometimes it occurred to Natásha that he did not wish to see her, and this conjecture was confirmed by the sad tone in which her elders spoke of him. Nowadays old friends are not remembered, the countess would say when Boris was mentioned. Anna Mikhaïlovna also had of late visited them less frequently, seemed to hold herself with particular dignity, and always spoke rapturously and gratefully of the merits of her son and the brilliant career on which he had entered. When the Rostovs came to Petersburg, Boris called on them. He drove to their house in some agitation. The memory of Natásha was his most poetic recollection, but he went with the firm intention of letting her and her parents feel that the childish relations between himself and Natásha could not be binding either on her or on him. He had a brilliant position in society thanks to his intimacy with Countess Bezúkhova, a brilliant position in the service thanks to the patronage of an important personage whose complete confidence he enjoyed, and was beginning to make plans for marrying one of the richest heiresses in Petersburg, plans which might very easily be realized. When he entered the Rostovs' drawing-room, Natásha was in her own room. When she heard of his arrival she almost ran into the drawing-room, flushed and beaming, with a more than cordial smile. Boris remembered Natásha in a short dress, with dark eyes shining from under her curls and boisterous childish laughter, as he had known her 4 years before, and so he was taken aback when quite a different Natásha entered, and his face expressed rapturous astonishment. This expression on his face pleased Natásha. "Well, do you recognize your little madcap playmate?" asked the countess. Boris kissed Natásha's hand and said that he was astonished at the change in her. "How handsome you have grown!" "I should think so," replied Natásha's laughing eyes. "And is Papa older?" she asked. Natásha sat down and, without joining in Borís' conversation with the countess, silently and minutely studied her childhood's suitor. He felt the weight of that resolute and affectionate scrutiny and glanced at her occasionally. Borís' uniform, spurs, tie, and the way his hair was brushed were all comme il faut and in the latest fashion. This Natásha noticed at once. He sat rather sideways in the armchair next to the countess, arranging with his right hand the cleanest of gloves that fitted his left hand like a skin, and he spoke with a particularly refined compression of his lips about the amusements of the highest Petersburg society, recalling with mild irony old times in Moscow and Moscow acquaintances. It was not accidentally, Natásha felt, that he alluded when speaking of the highest aristocracy to an ambassador's ball he had attended and to invitations he had received from N.N. and S.S. All this time Natásha sat silent, glancing up at him from under her brows. This gaze disturbed and confused Borís more and more. He looked round more frequently toward her and broke off in what he was saying. He did not stay more than 10 minutes, then rose and took his leave. The same inquisitive, challenging, and rather mocking eyes still looked at him. After his first visit Borís said to himself that Natásha attracted him just as much as ever, but that he must not yield to that feeling, because to marry her, a girl almost without fortune, would mean ruin to his career, while to renew their former relations without intending to marry her would be dishonorable. Borís made up his mind to avoid meeting Natásha, but despite that resolution he called again a few days later and began calling often and spending whole days at the Rostovs'. It seemed to him that he ought to have an explanation with Natásha and tell her that the old times must be forgotten that in spite of everything she could not be his wife, that he had no means, and they would never let her marry him. But he failed to do so, and felt awkward about entering on such an explanation. From day to day he became more and more entangled. It seemed to her mother and Sónya that Natásha was in love with Boris as of old. She sang him his favorite songs, showed him her album, making him write in it, did not allow him to allude to the past, letting it be understood how was the present. And every day he went away in a fog, without having said what he meant to, and not knowing what he was doing or why he came, or how it would all end. He left off visiting Helene, and received reproachful notes from her every day, and yet he continued to spend whole days with the Rostovs. End of chapter 12.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 13. Read for LibriVox.org by Robbie Rogers. One night, when the old countess, in nightcap and dressing jacket, without her false curls and with her poor little knob of hair showing under her white cotton cap, knelt sighing and groaning on a rug and bowing to the ground in prayer, her door creaked, and Natásha, also in a dressing jacket with slippers on her bare feet and her hair in curl papers, ran in. The countess, her prayerful mood dispelled, looked round and frowned. She was finishing her last prayer. Can it be that this couch will be my grave? Natásha, flushed and eager, seeing her mother in prayer, suddenly checked her rush, half sat down, and unconsciously put out her tongue as if chiding herself. Seeing that her mother was still praying, she ran on tiptoe to the bed, and rapidly slipping one little foot against the other, pushed off her slippers and jumped into the bed the countess had feared might become her grave. This couch was high, with a feather bed and 5 pillows, each smaller than the one below. Natásha jumped on it, sank into the feather bed, rolled over to the wall, and began snuggling up the bedclothes as she settled down, raising her knees to her chin, kicking out and laughing almost inaudibly, now covering herself up head and all, and now peeping at her mother. The countess finished her prayers and came to the bed with a stern face, but seeing that Natásha's head was covered, she smiled in her kind, weak way. Now then," said she. "Mamma, can we have a talk?" "Yes," said Natásha. "Now, just one on your throat and another, that'll do," and seizing her mother round the neck, she kissed her on the throat. In her behavior to her mother Natásha seemed rough, but she was so sensitive and tactful that however she clasped her mother, she always managed to do it without hurting her or making her feel uncomfortable or displeased. "Well, what is it tonight?" said her mother, having arranged her pillows and waited until Natásha, after turning over a couple of times, had settled down beside her under the quilt, spread out her arms, and assumed a serious expression. These visits of Natásha's at night, before the count returned from his club, were one of the greatest pleasures of both mother and daughter. "What is it tonight? But I have to tell you..." Natásha put her hand on her mother's mouth. "About Boris, I know," she said seriously. "That's what I have come about. Don't say it, I know. No, do tell me," and she removed her hand. "Tell me, Mamma. He's nice?" "Natásha, you are 16. At your age I was married. You say that Boris is nice. He is very nice, and I love him like a son. But what then? What are you thinking about? You have quite turned his head, I can see that." As she said this, the countess looked round at her daughter. Natásha was lying, looking steadily straight before her at one of the mahogany sphinxes carved on the corners of the bedstead, so that the countess only saw her daughter's face in profile. That face struck her by its peculiarly serious and concentrated expression. Natásha was listening and considering. "Well, what then?" said she. "You have quite turned his head, and why? What do you want of him? You know you can't marry him." "Why not?" said Natásha without changing her position. "Because he is young, because he is poor, because he is a relation, and because you yourself don't love him." "How do you know?" "I know. It's not right, darling." "But if I want to..." said Natásha. "Leave off talking nonsense," said the countess. "But if I want to... Natásha, I am in earnest." Natásha did not let her finish. She drew the countess's large hand to her, kissed it on the back, then on the palm, then again turned it over and began kissing first one knuckle, then the space between the knuckles, then the next knuckle, whispering, "January, February, March, April, May..." "Speak, Mamma! Why don't you say anything? Speak," said she, turning to her mother. who was tenderly gazing at her daughter, and in that contemplation seemed to have forgotten all she had wished to say. "It won't do, my love. Not everyone will understand this friendship dating from your childish days. And to see him so intimate with you may injure you in the eyes of other young men who visit us. And above all, it torments him for nothing. He may already have found a suitable and wealthy match, and now he's half crazy." "Crazy?" repeated Natásha. "I'll tell you some things about myself. I had a cousin—" "I know, Cyril Matvéich, but he is old." "He was not always old. But this is what I'll do, Natásha. I'll have a talk with Boris. He need not come so often." "Why not, if he likes to?" "Because I know it will end in nothing." "How can you know? No, Mamma, don't speak to him. What nonsense!" said Natásha, in the tone of one being deprived of her property. "Well, I won't marry, but let him come if he enjoys it, and I enjoy it." Natásha smiled and looked at her mother. "Not to marry, but just so," she added. "How so, my pet?" "Just so. There's no need for me to marry him, but just so." "Just so, just so," repeated the countess, and shaking all over she went off into a good-humored, unexpected elderly laugh. "Don't laugh, stop!" cried Natásha. "You're shaking the whole bed. You're awfully like me, just another giggler. Wait!" and she seized the countess's hands and kissed a knuckle of the little finger, saying "June," and continued kissing "July, August," on the other hand. "But, Mamma, is he very much in love? What do you think? Was anybody ever so much in love with you? And he's very nice, very nice." "And he's very nice, very, very nice, only not quite my taste. He is so narrow, like the dining-room clock. Don't you understand? Narrow, you know, gray, light gray." "What rubbish you're talking!" said the countess. Natásha continued. "Don't you really understand? Nicholas would understand. Bezúkhov, now, is blue, dark blue and red, and he is square." "You flirt with him too," said the countess, laughing. "No, he is a Freemason, I have found out. He is fine, dark blue and red. How can I explain it to you?" "Little countess!" the count's voice called from behind the door. "You're not asleep?" Natásha jumped up, snatched up her slippers, and ran barefoot to her own room. It was a long time before she could sleep. She kept thinking that no one could understand all that she understood and all that there was in her. "Sónya?" she thought, glancing at that curled-up sleeping little kitten with her enormous plait of hair. "No, how could she? She's virtuous. She fell in love with Nicholas and does not wish to know anything more. Even Mamma does not understand. It is wonderful how clever I am and how charming she is," she went on, speaking of herself in the third person and imagining it was some very wise man, the wisest and best of men, who was saying it of her. "There is everything, everything in her," continued this man. "She is unusually intelligent, charming, and then she is pretty, uncommonly pretty, and agile. She swims and rides splendidly. And her voice, one can really say it's a wonderful voice." She hummed a scrap from her favorite opera by Cherubini, threw herself on her bed, laughed at the pleasant thought that she would immediately fall asleep, called Dunyásha the maid to put out the candle, and before Dunyásha had left the room had already passed into yet another happier world of dreams, where everything was as light and beautiful as in reality, and even more so because it was different. Next day the countess called Boris aside and had a talk with him, after which he ceased coming to the Rostovs. End of chapter 13.